Mondays with Mike.
It's going to be a bumpy ride for 2025.
All right, welcome back to Mondays with Mike. Okay, next topic, immigration and deportation. This week, a friend of mine who hires somebody from Venezuela, and that person is here in this country and was here legally, but now is in danger of deportation anyway. And somebody brought this up with me, without even knowing that I was doing a podcast on it. So there's a real concern that people who were in the U.S. legally are now going to be deported, in addition to the other deportations occurring. So there were two clips, and one of them was from Tom Homan, Trump's border czar, and he said, "We want to get as many criminals as possible." And when I hear criminals, I think, oh, he's talking like they were guilty of robbery in their country, and they're.
Is that what you're hoping for? Look, we want to get as many criminals as possible.
But then, from the press secretary, Karoline Leavitt, she said the following. This is from a press conference streamed live by PBS on January 28th to YouTube. Peter Alexander of NBC News is addressing White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. This is under video 2 of episode 3 on the Mondays with Mike website. Peter Alexander says, "Just following up on the question on immigration first. President Trump, during the course of the campaign in 2024, said the following about illegal immigration. He said, 'They're going back home where they belong, and we start with the criminals. There are many, many criminals.'" Peter Alexander continues, "NBC News has learned that ICE arrested 1,179 undocumented immigrants on Sunday, but nearly half of them, 566 of the migrants, appear to have no prior criminal record beside entering the country illegally. Is the president still focused exclusively, which is a civil crime, it's not criminal, Karoline Leavitt, it's a federal crime. Peter Alexander, so I'm asking, he said he was going to focus on those violent offenders first. So is violent offenders no longer a predicate for people to be deported?" Karoline Leavitt replies, "The president has said countless times on the campaign trail, and I've been with him at the rallies, I know you've been there covering him too, Peter, that he is focused on launching the largest mass deportation in American history of illegal criminals. And if you are an individual, a foreign national, who illegally enters the United States of America, you are, by definition, a criminal. And so, therefore, you are subject to deportation." Peter Alexander, my apologies for interrupting. So to be clear, violent criminals do not receive precedence in terms of deportation taking place? Karoline Leavitt, the president has also said, two things can be true at the same time. We want to deport illegal criminals, illegal immigrants from this country, but the president has said that, of course, the illegal criminal drug dealers, the rapists, the murderers, the individuals that have committed heinous acts on the interior of our country and who have terrorized law-abiding American citizens, absolutely those should be the priority of ICE. But that does not mean that the other illegal criminals that entered our nation's borders are off the table. There it is. There's the shift. I don't like that. What do you think about that shift in language? What do you think about the shift? First of all, do you agree that there has been a shift?
Yeah, no, so there absolutely has been a shift. You create a group that you say are undesirable, the enemy from within, and then you categorize the entire group with a sort of indifference to the actual, if they've committed crimes of a violent nature or have actually gone through the criminal justice system. And that shift is concerning. It's problematic just from the executive order sending individuals to Guantanamo Bay in that detention center where they say there's 30,000 beds. Well, that's outside of the borders of the United States. That's a separate sort of like offsite facility. And compared to previous administrations, deportations have happened before, but they haven't been so adamant of broadcasting the deportations, of putting deportees on military planes, of using shackles and chains and all this, very overstated language, right? That I think is a lot different because they're trying to sell it to the American people and they're trying to make a show of it. So that was my immediate thought, that it looks an awful lot like what Hitler tried to do.
There are civil offenses and criminal offenses, and the clip was that of Peter Alexander, and he said 566 of them had no prior or criminal record besides entering the country illegally, which is a civil, and unfortunately he said civil crime, but I wrote civil offense, not a criminal offense. Like, if Mike goes 64 miles per hour in a 60, I'm not going to say Mike is a criminal. That would be ridiculous. If I'm violating a noise ordinance, nobody's going to say Bud is a criminal. Coming to the United States is of a greater magnitude, certainly, but people have been coming to this country for a long time. I would say the harm would be more in dispute. So I don't think that civil offenses should be called crimes.
It's a semantic distinction. If you've listened to Homan in some of the interviews, he says that the code classifies it as a misdemeanor. And if you follow the logic, it could be considered a civil offense, could be considered a crime if somebody is fined, for instance. They don't pay the fine, and then a bench warrant is issued for their arrest for not paying the fine. And in the case of undocumented immigrants, the issue is that without knowing who these individuals are, when somebody applies for legal immigration, they have to go through a whole series of questions. Who are you? Where are you from? What's your background? And on and on and on. The issue with undocumented immigrants and why they can say, oh, they're criminals, is that they can say, we don't know who these people are. And because we don't know who these people are, they could be any number of really bad actors. And that's why they're using this national security language as a justification for effectively incarcerating pretty much everyone, using a very broad brush. And they're not all criminals by any measure. Colombia has said that a lot of those individuals were children and pregnant women when the Trump administration was saying that everybody on the plane that was sent to Colombia was a criminal. So it's a messaging campaign. They're doing, some Orwellian stuff. They're trying to use a kind of doublespeak. That's how they're justifying a lot of the actions they're taking, especially the emergency powers. By calling it an invasion of the southern border, they're using the same kind of language of enemy combatants, the same justification that's used for keeping people in prison without charging them, in some cases, with a crime. It's definitely different. It's an unusual situation that is going on in the United States right now.
Yeah. And, if indeed, it was a murderer, and they knew it was, etc., then, in my mind, it's good that that person's country of origin pays for their sentencing for that murder of which they were convicted. But I think it diminishes the power of the word crime to, say somebody who wanted a better life and came to this country, that they're a criminal by virtue of not following our immigration process.
I'll just say one thing about the criminal description. So if any of these individuals are entering the country and working with a false identity or working in any manner where they're not reporting their income for taxes, that is tax evasion is a criminal offense, right?
Yes.
So anybody who enters the country seeking a better life for themselves and works for any amount of income that doesn't actually get reported under their actual name is in fact engaging in what criminal tax evasion looks like. And that is technically a crime. And so it's okay, yes, it is a civil offense to just enter the country, but the criminal offenses are different. And so that just bears mentioning because there's a huge black market of identities that get stolen and are used for employment, and there's also getting paid under the table. And the issue is that with money flows like that does have to do with national security because you want to know where money is going so that bad actors don't get to use huge amounts of resources within the country to do bad things. Sorry, that was just something I was thinking about of why they might be calling them criminals for another reason independent of just being undocumented immigrants.
Yeah. And it's important to consider all angles here because if we don't, if we just, oh, we can't consider that angle, then we can't talk about it and we can't respond to it. I hear undocumented immigrants, oh, they pay into, what is it? Do they pay into Social Security and Medicare or do they pay in, yeah, they pay into it, some, and even though they're not going to draw from it, and then some of them pay income tax too. That's what I heard. But are you saying they're doing that via stolen identities? Or is it some are doing it through some else?
So that's the whole issue with this entire debate is that we do not know the exact number of individuals. We know that at least some are because they've been found out that individuals who were dead or who are living but have their identity stolen, that they are being used to secure employment. It's a known, I mean, it's publicly known information that that is happening. I would also argue for something where they're paying taxes or they're contributing to Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare and not deriving a benefit from it. That's not good, right? For either side. It's not good from a labor perspective because they can undercut all legitimate workers. And it's not great from a moral perspective because they're being exploited, right? That they're participating in a system that they're not deriving an equal benefit from despite contributing the same amount of labor to it. Do you get why that's not great?
I definitely do, and it reminds me of a common argument that I would hear in the aughts, which was that the immigrants are doing work that Americans won't want to do at wages that they won't want to do it.
I don't buy that argument for 1 second, right? So the only reason that employers and these farmers can offer those wages, those jobs at those wages, is because of the fact that there is a pool of labor that will work at those wages. If they don't have an option but to pay people at least like a prevailing minimum wage or like higher wages in a competitive free market, then maybe those businesses don't get to exist in a competitive capitalist system. Somebody else will come along and buy them up who will pay at some point somewhere along the chain actual living wages. It doesn't sound great that the best argument is that people don't want to do the job. They just don't want to do the job at the amount that those jobs are paying.
And it's exploitation, really.
Absolutely. It's 100% exploitation.
Yeah, right. That's exactly what I was going to say. Like, if they can't pay the rate that must be paid, then that job won't get done. And because we determine that rate, it's like no job should be posted which cannot provide this basic rate. And it's pretty darn low. I have long been in favor of ending that kind of exploitation and, minimum wage. Or, like, if they want to work out something, well, that's beside the point. I'm not going to get into that. To conclude, I guess if they're in the country and they've jumped the line, maybe they should pay a fine, but we should make some sort of humanitizing of this whole process. It's like, hey, we know you jumped the line. It's going to be a penalty of some kind, but, it's not a criminal offense. So I'm not saying it should be nothing, but you're right. We don't want to create an environment where identity theft is the way that this is done, and there's a black market which enables more crime, which probably subjects those involved to greater indignities and greater dangers. I want to make it as humane as possible in that manner.
Individuals are traveling to the United States to seek safety, security, economic opportunity, any number of reasons. The legitimate system of immigration takes a very long time, and there are very strict quotas of who's allowed in from which countries. And so a lot of these individuals are traveling from countries where the current system just doesn't have a line that they can enter without waiting 10 years, 20 years, 30 years just for legal immigration. And so the current incentives are to pay someone to enter the country legally, and it's very lucrative, which is why I think Trump is going after the cartels and the various organizations, because there is that human trafficking element that is a multi-billion-dollar industry of people paying, in some cases, their whole life savings to travel to the United States on the chance they can stay here. There should be some kind of amnesty, but there's not going to be, because amnesty would create a terrible incentive, right? That if enough people show up and the problem looks bad enough, then the government just throws their hands in the air and goes, "We give up," and lets everybody stay here who wants to. It would just increase the overall number of people who try to enter the United States illegally. And so it's a very complicated topic, no doubt.
It sure is. So, and the person who gave the amnesty was
Ronald Reagan.
Reagan. Yeah, maybe Reagan's to blame for all this. To kind of do the thing that the news does, where they give the other side a little plug in there so they can say they're balanced, I will say Caroline Leavitt later clarified that violent offenders and drug dealers should indeed be given priority for deportation ahead of other, as she said, illegal criminals. So she said that, but the language shift persists. So the next story has to do with the news's coverage of matters of controversy. Obviously, there was a flurry of activity right at the beginning of Trump's second term in terms of executive orders. But it seems like in the following story, let's just say NBC devoted a majority of its coverage to pardoning the January 6th rioters, but only very little about, for example, energy policy. And I would venture to say that energy policy is going to have a bigger impact on people than pardoning the January 6thers. That's my personal opinion. Let's take a look and see what we see. This story is video 3 of episode 3 on the website, January 21st. Lester Holt and then Peter Alexander talk about the January 6thers and Trump pardoning them, even though various Republicans like J.D. Vance had said the violent ones should not receive a pardon, had said that prior to Trump pardoning them. So the story's like 5 minutes long, and I'm not going to transcribe it. And it's an important story, doubtless, but compare it to the very little coverage that Trump's changes to energy policy get.
Those pardons among stacks of executive actions already signed by President Trump, including many focused on reversing Biden administration policies, declaring a national energy emergency to repeal regulations on oil drilling and fossil fuels, and scrapping Biden border policies.
So not even a full sentence, 2 clauses in a complex sentence. So what do you think about that, Mike? Half of that segment, more than half, is about the pardoning of January 6th people, and you get 2 clauses, not even a full sentence, but 2 clauses within a complex sentence about the energy policies and about immigration in that particular story. They do talk more about immigration in other stories, to give them credit, but energy policy, not so much. And Senator Sanders, amendment about H-1B visas, not at all. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a big deal, right? So Trump's justification for the massive deportations that are happening in the country in the foreseeable future has to do with crime. And so it sends a strange message when there's a blanket pardon for a considerable number of criminals within the first few days of his administration. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that a pardon can't be reversed once it's given if someone accepts the pardon. And so when Trump says, "Oh, we'll look into it, oh, we're going to review it," no, right? If the pardons have already been issued, that's done. And so the question is, what was the hurry? Couldn't they have, sat down and just looked at 50, however, whatever the number is? I mean, the federal government has people who could have just sat down and on a case-by-case basis look, oh, this person attacked a cop. Maybe they shouldn't get a pardon. So that at least the messaging is consistent with what his messaging was throughout the campaign, that he backs police officers, that he supports law enforcement, etc. In terms of the impact, the energy policy one's going to have a much greater impact, but it's an impact in the distant future, right? And that's because of climate change. So if the IPCC report is even remotely true about the impacts on global populations in terms of migration, in terms of increases of natural disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, you name it, increasing domestic fossil fuel production by declaring a national emergency and increasing the overall amount of fossil fuels, because that's what this refers to, the executive order of what he's trying to do, lifting restrictions on fossil fuel drilling and production in national parks and other places. That's going to have a huge outsized impact on, not just the United States population, the world population. Will the pardons have that effect? No, right? It's 1,500 people at most. It's a one-time thing. They're going to be, that bird has flown. Whatever happens, happens. It just sends an inconsistent message about crime from Trump, about what it means to have the rule of law, and that there are certain consequences if someone admits to committing, very serious crimes that result in very long sentences, that they should, serve those sentences and not be released early for historical events.
Because this whole thing sort of reminds me of Ford pardoning Nixon, and the justification that Ford gave for that was, I don't remember whether he said a quarter or half of his time every day was being spent with the fallout from the Nixon thing, so he pardoned him because at the very least the country is better served when Ford can get on with his duties. My wife said, well, he was looking at them, Trump was looking at them, and then he says, F it, just pardon, all of them, because it was taking him too long. And I thought about that for a second, and I thought, okay, in abstract, the president's time is valuable, sure. But then I thought, wait a minute, he could have just referred it to a set of trusted advisors, and then those advisors come back to him, where it's like, this guy was violent, this person, stabbed the, officer in the neck with a stun gun or whatever it was, whereas these other people, they weren't violent, maybe you pardon them, maybe you don't pardon the stun gun guy. That made more sense to me when I thought of it.
He's been running for office for 4 years or whatever it is, right after Biden got elected. All that time that they could have sat down, because these people were already in prison or their cases had already gone through the courts for a lot of them. A significant number of these pardons that were issued. What's the rush, right? Why didn't they already have a pre-vetted list of people who committed violent, crimes against law enforcement? Maybe they don't get a pardon. Right? It just sends a really inconsistent message, and it puts the Republican senators and congressmen in this very difficult position of defending the president's actions, going against just years of messaging on their part of supporting law enforcement, supporting cops. It's a very troubling issue, because there's a lot of stakeholders involved supporting the Republican Party that are from law enforcement or law enforcement adjacent, and it doesn't look good to send that message ever to your base of supporters when you don't have to. It's sort of like an unforced error, in the sense that it didn't have to happen, and that it did happen is a sort of political problem, right? It felt really bad that on day one there's a blanket pardon for, in some cases, violent criminals.
And we're a nation of laws, and we must be a nation of laws, not a nation of the dictums of one guy. So yeah, the January 6th thing is important, doubtless. But we agree that, so not, without saying whether there should be more or less discussion about it, you do agree that there should be more discussion about energy policy, and that the ramifications should be more considered, as opposed to just, oh yeah, now we're drilling more.
Well, yeah, so the U.S. left the Paris Agreement again.
Yeah.
And the U.S. is in a global competitive market for energy production with, all the other countries that are trying to decide, do we produce more or do we produce less energy? It sends a terrible message to the rest of the world if the United States, already a huge producer of gas and oil and other fossil fuels, suddenly ramps up production, while also climate change is a really bad problem and everybody's going to be affected, and then all the other countries should not increase their energy production. They don't like it because it affects their economic output, and it just also diminishes the strength of the Paris Agreement if you don't have one of the largest countries that agreed to it and run into the future with eyes closed and heads in the sand, going, the sand has lots of oil. Let's go get that oil instead of,
Head
the
in the sand because it has lots of oil. Good
this
one.
energy policy needs to be talked about way more because it has significant impacts on way more people.
I wonder if there's a geostrategic implication here too, because, and this would actually be the flip side of it, because Russia, of course, at war in Ukraine, spending a lot of money, but they're getting some money because of oil from China, etc., maybe India. Are they trying to drive down the cost of oil to put pressure on Russia? Do you think that entered into the considerations?
Sure. I mean, there's probably a lot of factors going into the consideration. The big one, though, is that Trump made a promise to the oil executives in that speech early on in the campaign where he said, back me and I'll make you all richer. Pretty much. I mean, that was the gist of what he was saying. He made a promise to them and he's kept it. Day one, he's lifting, restrictions on domestic energy production. That's a big deal. But yeah, of course, there's geopolitical implications. If there's more oil, that means that there's more ability for nations to do war.
All right. Well, we're almost out of time. Thank you for taking the time out of your day.
Sure. I like to talk.
Yeah. And hopefully our viewers like to listen, yeah.
Right.
We'll see you next week here on Mondays with Mike.